her story from Tennessee. At my husband's funeral, no one came except me. However, they dig a hole next to my husband's grave with note, "Sleep with him." I parked the car in that empty lot next to the chapel and stepped out. Teeth chattered in the cold Tennessee wind as I pulled my coat tighter. The air tasted of late autumn, of leaves turning and losing, of endings whispered but never heard. I walked slowly toward the open doors of the funeral home, each step a carefully chosen sacrifice because I still believed in dignity, even when no one else seemed to. Inside, the chapel was silent. Chairs sat in neat rows that nobody filled. Floral arrangements stood like sentinels guarding absence. I took the front row, hoping, for a fraction of a moment, someone else would walk in. No one did. I waited, my breath shallow, my eyelashes iced over. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. I left the chapel early. Outside in the courtyard, I saw it, a shallow hole dug beside my husband's grave. Not the proper grave-sized cut into the earth, but a small, careless scoop, as if someone intended to toss in something worthless. The shallow pit beside George's grave wasn't for a second burial. It was a message that I was worthless. A second grave, a mockery. A wooden stake leaned in the dirt at the edge of the pit. A piece of cardboard flapped against the stake in the wind. I stepped closer and read the words, "Sleep with him. The worms are waiting." My heart arrested. I stood there, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood they saw me as what I had whispered to myself in the darkest nights, a parasite. A leech attached to his name, feeding off his life until my own body would collapse into dust. That hole wasn't for a second burial. It was for metaphor. It was their statement on me. Useless, burdensome, expendable. They didn't come. Peter had sent a text. "Mom, something came up. Can't make it. No call. No excuse." Celia didn't send anything. Then a message. "Mom, you should go down too. It'll be simpler if both of you left at once." I held my phone in the dark car for a minute too long, staring at that message as though it were a bullet. The funeral director watched me from the entrance. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, do you want us to wait a few more minutes?" I pressed my lips together. "No," I said. "Let's start." George would have hated a delay. The director nodded awkwardly and slipped back inside. Alone, I turned toward the hole again. The dirt was piled haphazardly at the edge, the shovel marks still fresh. I stood there and felt the wind slap my face, no longer just cold, but full of weight. I realized I had been standing aside for 47 years in a house I built, a life I held together like fragile glass, and for what? The groundskeeper nodded from afar. No words, just quiet understanding. I thought of all the empty chairs, the ones in the chapel, the ones at our dinner table, the ones in the photo albums gathering dust. I thought of the rose bushes George planted each spring, bright red blossoms by June, and now bare stems by November. I thought of the toast we shared on our 40th anniversary, laughter and wine, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we still had something. They lowered the coffin. Dirt hit wood. I didn't cry. I had done my grieving long ago. Before I stepped away, I placed a single white rose on the coffin. One. Even if no one else came, I would bring something. I turned, looked at the stake, the hole, the cardboard sign. I didn't shove the sign away. I didn't rip it up. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat for a long moment. The keys felt heavy in my palm. In that car, I let myself breathe. I understood. They weren't imagining things. They had laid out the plan already. They considered me dead and buried, only that my body remained. I started the engine, the tires crunching over gravel, and drove home under a sky going gray-blue, threadbare, honest. I married George Holloway on a hot June morning in 1971. He came home from Vietnam wearing a medal and silence, his hands trembling even when he smiled. At first, I mistook that silence for strength. I mistook his detachment for dignity. The way you do when you want to believe someone is good because you already promised to love them forever. He was magnetic, then broad-shouldered, handsome in a way that made other women nod respectfully. Men called him Captain Holloway, even when he left the army and tried to settle into civilian life. But what came home wasn't the same man I married. It started slow, the way rot does. A snap in his voice when dinner wasn't hot enough. Long stretches of quiet followed by explosions over spilled milk. He lost job after job, always someone else's fault. The government let him down. His boss was an idiot. The kids were too loud. I was too soft. I told myself he was tired. I told myself war did something to a man that wives would never understand. I told myself it was my job to hold the house up while he tried to rebuild himself. But what I didn't see then, what I only learned too late, was that some men don't want rebuilding. Some men want ruins. George didn't want to heal. He wanted everyone else to limp. When Peter was born, George softened for about a month. He held that baby like it was a medal he earned. But when the colic came and the sleepless nights followed, the rage returned. He slammed doors, yelled in the hallways. He never raised a hand to Peter, but he raised too many to me. The first time he hit me, it was open palm. He was drunk, and I had asked if we could skip church. My face stung, my ears rang, and I didn't speak for the rest of the day. The next morning, he kissed my cheek where the bruise bloomed and told me, "You should know better." When Celia was born, I hoped it might soften him permanently. But daughters did not make him gentle. They made him louder. He didn't touch her either, but he shouted until her hands trembled. He mocked the way she cried. He called her weak, soft, spoiled. She was 6 when she first asked me, "Is Daddy mad because I was born?" I tried to be the balance. I tried to bake love into casseroles and hide comfort in bedtime stories. I told them their father was hurting but trying. I told them he didn't mean it. I told them families are worth fighting for. What I didn't tell them, what I didn't admit to myself, was that I was already too afraid to leave. When Peter was 10, he walked into the kitchen while George shoved me into the table. I slipped and hit the edge. Blood came fast, from my mouth or my nose, I don't remember. George froze when he saw Peter standing there, silent. Peter asked, "Why did Daddy push you?" I wiped my lip and said, "I tripped, baby. I'm just clumsy today." Peter stared at me for a long time, then turned and walked out. He never brought it up again. But something in his eyes changed after that. A distance settled between us like fog. Celia, on the other hand, grew up furious. By the time she was 17, she had sharpened her tongue into a weapon. She came home one night, threw her books onto the kitchen counter, and screamed, "You are not a victim. You let him ruin everything. You watched him tear this house apart, and you stood there, making excuses. You let him scream at me like a dog. You let him treat Peter like a mistake. You didn't stop him. You hid behind aprons and casseroles. You're just as guilty." I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because somewhere deep down, I feared she might be right. I wanted to tell her that I once packed a suitcase, that I once stood at the edge of the driveway, keys in hand, heart racing, Peter in one arm, Celia in the other. I wanted to tell her that I turned back because I was afraid George would find us and hurt us worse. I wanted to say that I stayed not because I was weak, but because I thought protecting them meant being present, no matter the cost. But the truth is, that was a lie too. I stayed because I couldn't imagine life outside the prison I'd helped build. And children, especially bright, angry ones, can smell cowardice the way dogs smell fear. When Celia was accepted to college, the tuition bill came faster than George's paycheck ever could. I pawned my wedding necklace, a small gold locket with our initials carved inside. It wasn't worth much, but it covered her books and first semester fees. I left the receipt in her backpack so she would know. She did. And 1 week later, she looked me in the eye and said, "Don't play the martyr. Nobody asked you to suffer." That line stuck harder than any slap George ever gave me. Nobody asked you to suffer. That was the truth, wasn't it? No one did. I had made that choice. I had clung to silence as if it were a virtue. And by doing so, I had taught my children to confuse endurance with complicity. Years passed. Peter moved out, then away. Celia graduated and never came back for holidays. George got sicker, slower, and eventually quieter. The violence faded into muttering. The rage dissolved into aches. He died not with a bang, but with a cough and a whispered, "Leave the light off." By then, my children were already strangers. Not because I didn't love them, but because love when mixed with fear and failure becomes a foreign language. Now, sitting in that quiet house with his death certificate on the table, I looked around and realized I had survived a war too. But I wasn't the hero. I was the collateral damage. And the saddest part? My children didn't hate their father for what he did. They hated me for what I allowed. When I came back from the cemetery, the house greeted me with the kind of silence that hums. Every room looked too neat, too preserved, as if George had never truly left, just paused mid-existence. His glasses rested on the nightstand, the last thing he touched. I stood in the doorway and whispered his name once, softly, just to see if it would echo. It didn't. I took off my coat, folded it on the chair, and went straight to the cabinet in our bedroom. The safe was behind a row of neatly labeled files, all in his handwriting: insurance, taxes, deeds, estate. He'd always liked order. I punched in the same code we'd used since the kids were small. The latch clicked, a sound sharper than I remembered. Inside, beneath some documents and an envelope of old bonds, was the will. I sat down on the bed, the paper cold against my fingers. I opened it carefully. The date, 7 years old. George's signature at the bottom, bold, deliberate, and underneath, the lines that stripped me of breath: all assets, property, and savings to be divided equally between Peter and Celia. There was no mention of me except for the standard phrase, "To my beloved wife, for her lifetime use of the residence." I stared at that sentence until the words lost shape. Lifetime use. I had been reduced to a tenant in the house I had cleaned for 40 years. Though the will named me only for lifetime use, the house had long since been legally mine, paid off with my inheritance, registered in both our names. Though the will named me only for lifetime use, the house had long since been legally mine, paid off with my inheritance, registered in both our names. Beside the will was another envelope, thinner, sealed with tape yellowed by time. The handwriting on the front was his uneven, trembling slightly. May. I opened it, careful not to tear. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I never knew how to say sorry without sounding like a coward. You deserved better than the way I spoke to you, better than the silence I left in every room. I spent our life fighting shadows I brought home from the war. I thought I was protecting you by keeping them to myself, but I only made you smaller. You should have had more. Take everything, except the sadness. That part belongs to me. G. My hands shook. Not from grief, not exactly, but from the weight of what he hadn't said while alive. That letter was the first time he had ever admitted the truth that his cruelty wasn't anger at me, it was disgust at himself. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. I looked around the room. On the wall hung a photograph from our 25th anniversary. George, smiling stiffly beside me. Peter in his new suit. Celia rolling her eyes behind the camera. We had survived so much together, too much, maybe. But now, with the will in my hand and the letter beside it, something inside me finally broke in the right direction. I had lived half a century waiting for apologies that never came. Now one arrived when no one could hear it. What good was remorse buried under dirt? What good was inheritance built on neglect? I sat there for a long while before picking up the phone. My fingers dialed from memory. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Thomas Fields," my lawyer said, brisk, steady. "Thomas," I replied, my voice calmer than I felt. "It's May Holloway." "May? My condolences again. I heard about George's passing. Are you all right?" "I've been worse," I said, "and better. I need to make changes to the estate." He hesitated. "You mean to your joint holdings? We finalized those provisions 2 years ago." "I want them undone," I said, "completely." "May, I have to advise." "Thomas," I interrupted, "listen to me. I just read his will. Everything goes to Peter and Celia, not a line for anyone else, not even for the one who buried him alone. You and I both know they don't deserve it. Do you want to discuss it first? He asked gently. I've spent my entire life discussing. I'm done. I want to erase their names from everything under my control, every account, every deed. I don't care about optics, or family harmony, or forgiveness. That ship sank years ago. He paused, maybe searching for words, then said, All right, we'll meet tomorrow morning. I'll draw up new documents. You'll need to sign in person. Good, I said. And Thomas? Yes? Bring the clean forms. I don't want to see their names again. After hanging up, I walked through the house, turning off lights room by room, like closing a book chapter by chapter. In the kitchen, I noticed the faint reflection of myself in the window glass, older, smaller, still breathing. I poured a glass of water, stared at the ripples, and thought about what the children would say when they found out. They'd call me spiteful, ungrateful, dramatic. They'd forget that they hadn't come to the funeral, hadn't called once since he fell ill. Peter would rationalize. Celia would roll her eyes. They didn't hate me because I was cruel. They hated me because I reminded them what cruelty looks like when it grows up polite. They didn't hate me because I was cruel. They hated me because I reminded them what cruelty looks like when it grows up polite. I took the will and the letter to the dining table, spread them side by side. One was legal, the other human. One written by the man the world knew, the other by the man only I had glimpsed fleetingly, in moments of weakness. I realized, sitting there under the hum of the ceiling fan, that I had been married to two George, the one who hurt and the one who regretted. But regret doesn't pay back lost years. It doesn't heal what indifference corrodes. I reached for a pen and wrote on the back of the letter, Apology received, freedom accepted. Then I put both papers back into the envelope and locked it in the drawer. It was almost midnight when the power flickered briefly. I stood by the window, looking at the dark outline of the rose bushes outside. For a second, I imagined him standing there with his old pruning shears saying, Cut what's dead before it spreads. He used to say that about the garden. Now I finally understood what it meant. The next morning, I dressed in gray, tied my hair neatly, and took the will with me. The sky was clear, mercilessly so. As I locked the door, I whispered to the empty hallway, George, I'm cutting what's dead. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel guilty. I felt alive. The day after I told Thomas I wanted their names erased, I returned to his office and signed the paperwork with hands steadier than I expected. I had transferred ownership to Ethan 2 months before George passed. Quietly, permanently. My lawyer looked over his glasses and asked, So where do you want it to go, May? We can set up a charitable foundation, or... I want it all in trust, I said. Under one name, Ethan Holloway. He blinked. Peter's son? Yes, Peter's son. My grandson. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands, measuring his next words. I just want to be clear, you're bypassing your children entirely. I am, I said, voice low but firm. They've made it clear who I am to them. It's time I return the clarity. Thomas hesitated, then pulled a legal pad closer. All right, what are the terms of the trust? No cash withdrawal for at least 3 years. No property sale. He can live here or rent it, but not sell. No liquidating assets. And Peter and Celia are to have no claim or control. Not a dime, not a brick, not a blade of grass. He raised an eyebrow. You don't want a shared clause in case of emergency? I looked out the window and shook my head. The only emergency they recognize is when I say no. That night, I went into the attic and pulled out the old Christmas boxes. Inside one of them, beneath faded ornaments and a half-burned Advent candle, was a photo album. The last few pages were photos Ethan had taken when he was 13. I remember that Christmas. Peter had yelled at him at dinner for not sitting like a man. Celia had left halfway through dessert, calling the house depressing. Ethan stayed behind. He helped me clean. Later that night, I slipped on the porch steps while taking out the trash. My hip hit the concrete hard. I didn't scream, but Ethan heard me. He was upstairs, but he ran barefoot down, lifted me up slowly without a word, and helped me into the kitchen. He made me soup. He sat next to me while I winced through the pain and said only one thing. "Does it hurt, Grandma?" Not, "Why were you outside?" Not, "Why didn't you ask for help?" Just that. "Does it hurt?" That boy, now 22, had never asked me for a thing. He never complained about his father, never asked me to take sides, but every time he visited, he brought groceries. Every birthday, he wrote a note instead of buying a gift. Last year, he gave me a book of poems and underlined one line: "Some people grow from the dirt they were thrown into." Peter called him weak. He called him soft. I remember the day I overheard it. Peter was yelling because Ethan had left an internship to volunteer at a community kitchen. "You're soft like your damn grandmother," Peter said. "All feelings and no spine." I wanted to scream then, but I stayed silent, just like I had for decades. Until now. I told Thomas everything. I told him that the trust would go to Ethan not because he was blood, but because he showed up. Not because he was a man, but because he was kind. Not because he earned it by birth, but because he never asked to be rescued from the people he was supposed to trust. Thomas tapped his pen on the desk. "And what if Ethan refuses?" "He won't," I said, "because he's never taken anything, and this time he won't be taking. He'll be keeping it safe." Later, I called Ethan and asked him to come over. When he arrived, he hugged me like always tight, without hesitation. He wore those same old canvas shoes and a sweater with a stain he hadn't noticed. I told him to sit. He smiled, nervous. "What's going on, Grandma?" I slid the folder across the table. "That's the trust. This house, the savings, the cabin by the lake, everything." He blinked. "Wait. Grandma, I don't need—" I raised my hand. "I know you don't. That's why it's yours." He opened the folder slowly, read a few lines, then looked up with eyes already glassy. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He sat still for a long time. Then he whispered, "What about my dad? What about Aunt Celia?" "They had their turn," I said. "They turned away. You didn't." He started to shake his head, overwhelmed. "I don't want to hurt them." "You're not," I said gently. "They're hurt by the absence of what they never gave. That's their own doing." He closed the folder and pressed it to his chest. "I'll protect it, Grandma, I promise." I reached across the table, took his hand, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph, just a quiet kind of justice. And sometimes, that's all a woman like me ever needed. It was late afternoon when I heard the sharp knock at the door, too urgent to be neighborly, too loud to be kind. I knew it was Celia before I even stood up. There was something about the rhythm entitled impatient, almost angry at the wood for not opening itself. I opened the door, and there she stood. Makeup smudged, hair pulled back too tight, the whites of her eyes bloodshot. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me like the house still belonged to her, and dropped her purse on the table. "You think this is fair?" she snapped, arms crossed. "You really think what you've done is just?" I closed the door slowly. "Hello to you, too." "Don't start with me, Mother." Her voice cracked. "You rewrote the will. You erased me. You gave everything to that boy." I moved toward the kettle, calm, despite the storm in her voice. "Ethan's not just that boy. He's your nephew, and he's the only one who never turned away." Celia stepped closer. "You chose a failure over your own daughter. You picked weakness over blood. You humiliated me." I looked at her, truly looked. Beneath the fury was desperation real, raw. Her blouse was wrinkled, her nails bitten. Her voice trembled, not just with anger, but panic. I set the kettle down. "You didn't come to George's funeral." She scoffed. "What did you expect me to do? Celebrate the man who terrorized us?" "No," I said. "I expected you to show up for me." She stared, blinking fast, like I had slapped her. I walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a photo, the one from the funeral. I handed it to her. It was me, alone, standing beside the casket. In the background, the shallow hole. The wind had caught the edge of the cardboard sign that said, Sleep with him. I pointed. That's the love I buried. And that, I tapped the empty seats in the chapel. That's what you left behind. Celia looked at the photo for a long moment, then placed it on the table without comment. She sat down hard, exhaling as if her bones were cracking. Her voice came quieter now, but edged with resentment. Michael left, packed up and ran off with someone 10 years younger. Said I was cold. Said I reminded him of my father. I said nothing. Let her talk. Ethan won't return my calls. Says he's busy. Says he's building something. And now I find out the house, the accounts, everything, it's all gone. Tied up in some trust I can't touch. It's not gone, I said. It's just finally out of reach. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't wipe them. She didn't cry often, and never gently. I was angry, okay? I was a teenager watching her mother get slapped around while pretending it was love. You think I don't have the right to rage? You had every right, I said. You still do. Her head snapped up. That surprised her. But rage doesn't buy your children's safety, and it doesn't excuse what you became. She flinched. What I became? You stood by while your brother mimicked the same cruelty we both endured. You called Ethan names. You mocked his kindness. You let your pain rot, and then you fed it to the next generation. Her face twisted. I was surviving. So was I said, but surviving doesn't give us permission to destroy. She stood up again, pacing. You left us in hell and called it home. Don't act like you're the martyr now. I'm not the martyr, I said, my voice firm now. But I am the one who cleaned the blood off the floor. I am the one who stayed when I should have run. And yes, that makes me guilty of weakness. But what's your excuse, Celia? You saw it all. You knew better. And still you became him. She turned, face flushed. You don't get to judge me. You were supposed to protect us. I failed, I said quietly. But so did you. She sank into the chair, exhausted, defeated. For a moment, the room was silent. Then she whispered, So that's it? I'm cut off? No, I said. You're not cut off. You're just no longer entitled. She looked at me, eyes narrowing. You really think that boy can carry a legacy? He's already carrying what none of you could decency. And you know what else? He never asked me for anything. She laughed bitterly. Maybe because he knew you'd give it all away to the first one who said please. I walked toward the window, pulling aside the curtain. Outside, the garden Ethan helped me weed last spring had begun to bloom again, stubborn, determined. I turned back. He never said please. He just asked if I was okay. That's all. And for that alone, he earned every brick of this house. Celia stood up slowly, gathering her things, wiping her face with the back of her hand. At the door, she paused. I hope one day you realize what you've done. I do, I said. For the first time in my life, I see it all clearly. She looked like she wanted to say more, but the words betrayed her. She left without slamming the door. And I sat down in the chair she'd occupied, still warm from her anger. Sometimes, the worst battles are fought in whispers. And sometimes, the only thing left to say is nothing at all. Peter always had a way of walking into a room like he owned it, even when the walls were falling down around him. That Thursday afternoon, he did exactly that, stormed into the house he hadn't visited in months, dressed like a man who still thought he had something to prove. He didn't even knock, just pushed open the door and shouted, "Where the hell is she?" I stood up slowly from the kitchen table. "Peter," I said, "you're loud." His face was red, jaw clenched. He slapped a manila folder onto the table. "You transferred the deed? To Ethan?" I said nothing, just sat down. "I was going to sell this place," he snapped. "It's worth a fortune now. I already had a buyer lined up. The contract was ready. I signed." "Then you signed away something that wasn't yours," I said quietly. He looked like he'd been slapped. "You're telling me you gave this house to Ethan?" "Not just the house," I said. "Everything. The land, the savings, the lake cabin, all of it." He sank into a chair across from me, face crumbling. "I have debts, Mom, real ones. This sale was going to fix everything. Why would you give it to him?" I looked him in the eye. "Because he never once asked me what I was worth." He blinked fast, like he didn't understand the words. I stood, walked over to the side table, and pulled out the legal documents. I set them beside his folder. That's the trust. Ethan is the sole beneficiary. You were never listed. You think this is justice? He hissed. You think rewarding some soft-spoken boy who plays soup chef while the rest of us are drowning in reality is justice? I folded my hands. I think you grew up thinking cruelty was currency, and I'm done paying for it. He laughed, bitter and sharp. You think Ethan's going to protect it? You think that kid can handle business? Do you even know what you've done? Before I could speak, the front door opened again. This time, Ethan walked in, calm, hands in his pockets, a quiet storm behind his eyes. Peter stood up like someone had set him on fire. You let me sign a deal. You knew I was trying to sell it and you didn't say a damn word. Ethan looked him straight in the face. The company you sold it to is mine. Peter froze. What? I bought it through the trust, Ethan said. Legally, I already owned it. You sold property you didn't own, Dad. Peter backed up, shaking his head. That's fraud. It's not, I said softly. It's fact. Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. You set me up. No, Ethan replied. I saved you from committing a real crime. Right now, all you've done is embarrass yourself. Peter turned toward me. Tell him to give it back. Fix this. I'm not fixing anything, I said. You made your choices. I've made mine. Peter's voice broke. I needed that money. You don't understand. I do, I said. I understand that every time life told you no, you called it betrayal. And every time someone else paid the price for your mistakes, you called it fate. Peter dropped into the chair, hands in his hair. You hate me. I don't, I said. But I won't protect you anymore. Ethan stepped forward, pulled a folded document from his coat. Dad, you need to vacate the premises by next Friday. You can rent it back if you want, but ownership isn't on the table. Peter stared at the paper. I'm supposed to rent my childhood home from my own son? Ethan nodded. Yes, that's the consequence. You can choose to learn from it or let it poison you. Peter's eyes filled with tears. He wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't even a man in control. He was someone watching the world finally answer him with silence. I loved this house, he said, almost to himself. Then maybe you should have acted like it, I whispered. Peter stood, shaking. You're both heartless. Ethan's voice was calm, but unflinching. I forgive you, Dad, but I won't enable you. Peter didn't reply. He walked out without slamming the door. After he left, I looked at Ethan. Are you okay? He exhaled. Not really, but I know I'm doing the right thing. I nodded. That's more than I ever managed. And for the first time in decades, I felt the balance begin to tip. Not in anger, not in vengeance, just in truth. And truth, at last, was finally enough. Ethan came into the kitchen one morning, holding a rolled-up blueprint and that hopeful light in his eyes I had only ever seen in children who believed the world might still be kind. Grandma, he said, placing it on the table, I want to build something. I raised an eyebrow. You already did. A life, a future, a wall between you and all this mess. He smiled gently and unrolled the paper. No, I mean here, on the land, right where that second hole was. I stared at the drawing, a single-level open-air space surrounded by raised garden beds, benches, and a central kitchen. I want to turn it into a community garden and meeting space. For the elderly, for the ones nobody visits anymore, the ones who don't have family, or the ones whose families pretend they're invisible. I touched the edge of the blueprint, remembering that hole, remembering how cold it felt to look into it and see my dignity in the dirt. Why there? Ethan looked at me and said, because that was the ugliest thing I've ever seen done to you, and I want to bury it with beauty. I felt tears rise, not out of sadness, but out of a quiet kind of awe, the kind that sneaks up on you when you realize someone has been listening to you, even when you weren't speaking. Will you let me? He asked. I nodded. Turn it into something no one can look away from. Make them remember what it used to be, then make them proud of what it became. He got to work. He brought in local carpenters, hired a gardener who had once tended the mayor's estate. Volunteers came in, slowly at first, some from church, some from the neighborhood, and some from the very group that once whispered behind my back at the grocery store. I watched from the porch as they dug, planted, built. I brought them lemonade, just like I used to for George's crew back in '82 when he redid the roof. The difference now was they smiled back. They thanked me. They stayed longer than they had to. When the garden was ready, Ethan held a small ceremony. No mayor, no cameras, just folding chairs, iced tea, and a plaque on a wooden post at the garden's edge. It read, "Here once was a hole for the forgotten. Now it is soil for gratitude." Below it, in Ethan's neat handwriting, "Planted with kindness, watered by truth." I stood beside him as he unveiled it. A woman from across the street, who once told her son I was that poor old woman with the crazy family, came up to me with a tulip in hand. "I'd like to plant this," she said, "if you'll let me. I have a sister in a home. She used to love tulips." I nodded, speechless. She knelt beside the bed of lavender and pushed the bulb into the soil. Her son helped her stand. They both smiled at me, not with pity, but with respect. Others followed. A former co-worker of George's, a widow who lived 3 blocks over. They came with trowels, with stories, with apologies that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I stood beside the plaque as the sun dipped low, casting the garden in gold. "They used to think I should be in that hole," I whispered to Ethan. He looked around at the blooming beds, the benches now filled with laughter, and said, "Now they walk past it and see flowers." And I smiled, not because I had won anything, but because, at last, I had planted something that could not be taken away. Not by betrayal. Not by silence. Not even by time. The peach tree in the corner of the garden had bloomed again, soft pink blossoms swaying gently in the spring breeze. I sat beneath it, wrapped in my shawl, a warm cup of chamomile cradled between my hands. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that hurts. This was the kind of silence that made room for breathing. That morning, the mail brought a letter. I knew the handwriting even before I opened it. Celia. I hadn't seen her since she stormed out of this house, fire in her throat and ice in her eyes. The envelope was plain, almost tired-looking. Inside, just one sentence. "Mom, I've lost everything. I was wrong. I need you." There was no apology, no, "I'm sorry for leaving you alone to bury the man we both survived." Just loss, just need. I stood slowly and walked to the drawer where I kept the things I didn't throw away but couldn't quite look at either. There, among expired coupons and old checkbooks, was an empty ATM card, long inactive. I slipped it into an envelope, along with a note. "The day you didn't show up for your father's funeral was the day you buried me too." I mailed it without anger, not to punish her, just to remind her, not all things lost are taken. Some are simply left behind. A few days later, word reached me that Peter had been sued. The buyer he'd tried to swindle was taking him to court for breach of contract. His name had been on a deal for a house he didn't own. Ethan had been asked if he wanted to press charges. He declined. "Let the court handle it," he said. "My father's lesson doesn't need my permission." Peter was left to fend for himself. Ethan didn't save him, but he didn't bury him either. That's how I knew the boy had grown into a man I could believe in. Then came the letter from the mayor's office. They were honoring Ethan for his community work. The garden built on the very plot where they once left a hole for me had become a sanctuary. Elderly neighbors, once forgotten, now gathered there to laugh, plant, rest. Even those who once whispered about me came to volunteer. At the ceremony, a reporter asked Ethan, "What's the most important thing your grandmother ever taught you?" He paused, thoughtful, before replying, "That sometimes the person you curse ends up being the one who saves the whole family from the curse itself." I closed my eyes when I read that in the paper, not out of pride, but something deeper, a kind of peace that feels like the end of winter. And then, a week later, another letter, from Ethan this time, from college, new address, new beginning. "Dear Grandma," it read. "Leaving was hard. I wasn't afraid of school, I was afraid of being far from you. But I've realized love doesn't vanish with distance, it just echoes louder. I promise I'll make you proud. This trust isn't the end, it's the seed. I'll grow it into something that protects people the way you protected me. I don't want to be like my father. I want to be like the woman who chose to plant flowers where they once tried to dig her grave. I didn't choose blood, Grandma. I chose you. I folded the letter and held it against my chest. Across the yard, a volunteer knelt in the garden bed, trimming the lavender. Another was painting the bench I once watched the world from. The peach blossoms fell gently around them, like a blessing. They once dug a hole for me, hoping I'd lie down and disappear. Instead, I built a garden. And now, when they pass by, they don't see a grave. They see flowers. Thank you for staying with me through this story, from the bitter cold of silence to the warmth of something finally blooming. If it made your heart ache, or brought even the smallest tear to your eye, then maybe you've known someone like me. Or maybe you are someone like me. We don't tell these stories for revenge. We tell them because truth, when finally spoken, is the most powerful legacy of all. If you believe in stories that remember the forgotten, if you believe dignity doesn't come with age, but with endurance, then please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Let's keep these memories alive. Let's pass down strength, not silence. And remember, revenge has no expiration date. Wisdom doesn't shout, it remembers. See you in the next story.